Welcome to the second part of the Berean second session. This is April 15, 2016. We're now looking at archaeology, and now we'll look at the limitations of archaeology. There are good bits and there are bad bits. There are some things it can do and some things it cannot do. So I'm going to mention a few here. Excavations only take place at locations where the owners offer permission for a lengthy period of time with no economic interest to be realized, which means you can't dig in expensive real estate. That's not going to happen. So there's a limitation of geography. And then you've got expert investigators from a variety of specialized fields must be found who agree to work as a team for little monetary recompense under grueling conditions. So now you've got people. To find enough people with different skills, and they're all so highly skilled people, the chemists, the biologists, the botanists, the bioarchaeologists, to come together at the right time, normally 3 or 4 weeks in the summer, under terrible conditions, and then mostly not pay them, by the way. Kind of hard, right? So if you can assemble a team, it's incredible. What about the volunteers who do that? The non-professionals, you need a team of volunteers to do that. Normally you go for grad students, those who are doing the PhD, because they don't have a choice. They got to do it. And then you go for very well-informed lay people who want to have a go at it, want to taste what it's like. And even today, you charge them serious money, $3,000 to $4,000 US to be a laborer. Yeah, yeah. And people will have a go, and they'll try to do it. So it's very hard. Number 3, the limitations of archaeology. Reliance on a large team of unskilled volunteers and laborers tax the integrity of any dig, which means when you have unskilled people at a dig, there's a danger that they may not know what they're doing, and they could mess things up. So whenever you have volunteers, you also have a supervisor on the site. Will check, make sure you don't mess around. And here's one example. You go digging in an area, a quadrant, and they said, okay, we're going to dig layer by layer. Normally when you start, after the spring, the grass is growing, you spend a whole week weeding, just taking the grass and the roots out, and normally give it to the novices, the guys who can't do serious damage, who just came from college, young kids, do this, and they go back, I did archaeology. And then you get the next layer of people who got to know what they're doing. Now, those who have done weeding, they don't want to weed a second season. It's really no fun. You get insects, you get bites, and all kinds of stuff, right? And there are times you start digging, and then suddenly you go 3 or 4 layers down and say, this is great. Then you see a Coca-Cola bottle, for example, okay? And you go, oh dear, it's over. Because whatever it is, you know it was there in the 20th century, for example. Or you find a little plastic shoe and it says, made in Taiwan or whatever. It's over. You can start all over again or dig deeper. So these are some serious problems about the limitations of archaeology. Number 4, contrary interpretations of the same artifact are commonplace, and ambiguity must be expected. This is very painful and hard. When you find the same site, same data, now you got to interpret it. Remember I said it's a science and an art.
Same site?
Yep, same site. And you still have variants of is this or is it not? Because at a certain level, these are all circumstantial evidence. They're not proofs by definition. You see something, say you find a Roman coin, and you can date coins. And just to give an example, there are no coins in the world that have ever been found older than 700 BC. Okay, no coins in the world. To mint a coin, there's a lot of work. You need a lot of skills to find a way to mint. So minting is such a high technology that none in the world has been found before 700 BC. So you find a coin and you look for the date. And the coin, our coins here, maybe 2017, did I say that? 2007, 2014. And you trust that that's accurate. I hate to say this, in the old days, there were forgeries. There were coins with wrong dates. Sometimes there were coins with wrong claims, wrong countries. And I said, man, it's hard enough to do archaeology and there are forgeries? Oh yeah, no, forgery was a 20th century invention. They've been doing it for a long time. So you got to figure out it's not a forgery. And then what if you see is this gold? You got to cut it to make sure it's actually gold and not silver with lead inside. It happens too. And by determining the composition of the coins, the way and where it was found, you can determine, or you can have a good guess on what it refers to. Later on you find another coin and you go, wait a minute, they don't match, so which is it? So there are all these problems coming in. And these are human beings. They are also motivated for results that they hope to find. Remember, if you are a devout Christian doing archaeology, you will have expectations different from, say, someone who's not. But the good thing about archaeology is you almost, in fact, I would say almost, you never dig by yourself. It's always in a large team. So there are checks and balances. Number 5, new research tools often lead to reinterpretation and correction of earlier conclusions. This is also another very painful thing for archaeologists. If you look at my own archaeology books, there's one right at the top. It's like a maroon, thick, long, big book next to the blue books at the top, right at the top where Chris is. Yeah, number 5, you see that? That is like the Bible of biblical archaeology, and they sort of publish it every few years to say, okay, we have seen all the archaeology of Israel for the past 75 years, and this is the latest state of affairs. And every archaeologist who has ever dug in Israel worried to death that their work 20 years ago is found to be defective or wrong, or whatever. But the good thing about this sort of peer review is it forces you to make sure that there are no sacred cows. Whatever you discover or you think is true has to survive the test of scrutiny with every generation, and it's a fair thing. So these are the 5 examples of limitations of archaeology. I mention this so that you may not think, if I don't know anything about archaeology, I've missed out on something. Well, not necessarily true. It's a help, but you need to know the limitations. Now, the politics of biblical archaeology. Early explorations were devoted to apologetics rather than to independent research. I mentioned this before. The earliest archaeologists coming from America were really clergymen. They were trying to prove the Bible. And when they couldn't prove the Bible, many of them lost interest. Some of them lost their faith, so to speak. Although you can't really lose your faith. Either you had it or you don't have it. And faith is a living thing. Over time, it shifts and it moves and it's okay. Why is it okay for a Christian? Because you're not saved by faith. If salvation exists in any meaningful sense, it's because God is God, not because you are you. Your knowledge about God is really cream. The Palestinian Exploration Fund, called PEF, in 1865 in Great Britain. What did they say was a stated goal? The stated goal for the exploration in Palestine was for biblical illustration. So their goal wasn't discovering what's true or not true. It was they assumed the Bible was historically accurate and scientifically accurate. Now they want illustration. Now we do that a lot in our sermons, by the way, right? Most successful pastors, they want to illustrate what they're saying. And they'll say things like, and just the other day, this was discovered. They love archaeology for what it can illustrate. The committee, now 1870, that was Great Britain, right, 1865. Now in 1870, the American version, called the Committee for the Palestine Exploration Society. What's their stated goal? For the illustration and defense of the Bible. It's very interesting how the two work. One is Great Britain, USA. Let me repeat what Great Britain says. For the illustration of the Bible. Let me tell you what the US said. For the illustration and the defense of the Bible. So the US version is always very nervous about defending the Bible for all kinds of reasons.
You said this was 1865?
1865 for Great Britain, 1870 for New York. And they both sent out to Palestine to do some serious archaeological work. And the goal for the British one was so that we can illustrate the Bible. The goal for the US was illustrating and defense, as if the Bible needed defending. Then you might ask, what are they defending the Bible against, really? And the conclusion was against the Germans. Why? Because around the same time, the Germans invented the science of modern history, the reconstructing reality. As I mentioned last week, it coincided with the invention of what we now call the camera. Not camera obscura, which is a very old thing, but the modern camera with the lenses. Today, new archaeology has changed the purpose of biblical archaeology so that it is now more concerned about the history of events. So the history of events is quite a new thing, believe it or not. For the longest time, it wasn't about history of events. It was about defending the Bible or illustrating the Bible. It has changed the purpose of archaeology so that it's to support theological interpretations of the Bible. So today, biblical archaeology is about, can we support a certain theological interpretation? Now, what do you mean by that? I mentioned last week, every reading is an interpretation. The moment you read it, you're interpreting it, whether you like it or not. Interpretation is not for professionals. It's for anyone who chooses to read anything, not just the Bible. So today, when someone says, I'm going to do a biblical archaeology in Israel or Turkey or even Italy, the moment you say it's for biblical archaeology, the modern goal is to see whether our interpretations in whichever church it is can be supported or cannot be supported. Now, what does it mean? If it cannot be supported, you've got to abandon it. And that's where the conflicts arise. Because for many denominations that were built upon interpretations, It's non negotiable. You're not going to abandon anything. And that's where the conflict between archaeology and, say, preaching begins. It's tricky, right? Let's look at the model of archaeological studies for Jerusalem. Here it is. Today, if you go to Jerusalem, you'll see this scale model, and you can have an idea what it looks like. It's quite big, by the way. It's bigger than this whole room. You've seen this one, right? Yeah. I think they just embellished it and made it nicer recently, since I was there. Can archaeology prove or disprove the Bible? Short answer: no. Archaeology illuminates but cannot confirm the Bible. It brings an understanding but not belief in the theology of faith. So, if there's a concern that archaeology can rob me of my faith, whatever it can do, it cannot do that. Because your faith should never be based on archaeology, ever, at all. How about its history? Well, archaeology cannot confirm the existence of Adam or Noah or Abraham or Moses. Why can't we confirm the existence of people in the past? Anybody?
Nothing of them remains.
Nothing of them should remain. If it remains, they're probably not human. Because it's degradable.
Yeah.
That's the first thing, right? What else? Once you don't have biological matter, everything else is secondary. Whether it's a writing or even a photograph or even a video, it's not a real thing. It's not the thing. So when you say, I want to use archaeology to prove is such a strong word that there are very few proofs in archaeology, but actually a lot of evidence, but very, very few proofs. What about the science bit? Archaeology cannot confirm the Old Testament accounts of David or Solomon or the New Testament miracles. That's a big one for Christians, right? For most of the Jewish world, although there are supernatural events attested in the Old Testament, it doesn't seem to be a biggie for many of the Jewish people. It's not like, oh, we're going to fight tooth and nail to say the sun actually stopped when Joshua said that. And it's not a big deal for them. For them, they were glad that God could do it and we were there.
But is the crossing of the Red Sea your lot of
Yeah, it's not a big deal for them. It's a big deal for us as Christians. But and here's the reason why.
You read the Old Testament, you read subsequent books, they constantly harken back to.
Right, they refer to it, but it's not today. The modern Jews, they're not going to lose sleep over it one way or the other. If you say, well, in fact, it's not the sea, not the Red Sea, but the Sea of Reeds, say, oh, okay, because they don't mind conflict. They don't mind having disagreement. Because their idea of God is much more almighty than our understanding. Because in the Christian world, for the longest time, God is trapped in a microcosm called the Bible. That means if I want to know God, I take God out, right?
But something like the Passover, which
Yeah.
is critical to like Jews even today, to say that is it more of a cultural thing?
It's much more cultural because so much of Hebraic ideas are symbolic, and to them the symbols are more important than the historicity. Very interesting development here. What happened in the Christian church was, by some people disagree about when. My guess is around about 1000 AD, just before the Crusades. There was this movement to say, the way we know that our faith is distinct and true is that we have a portable God. It's written in the text. And with the Bible, I can go anywhere and I can search for God inside here. And it went to the extent where God cannot be found outside the Bible. So if it's not the Bible, it can't be real. Until they discovered a big problem. The Bible itself refers to a lot of other books that's not within the Bible. So we have all kinds of issues when it comes to the study.
Ultra-Orthodox Jews have the same
Could you speak up?
view. Ultra-Orthodox Jews
Right.
have the same view because, they believe that this is their land.
Right.
They believe that, some of them don't even acknowledge the current state of Israel because
Right.
the Messiah has
And in practice, whatever they say, they still have to live in Brooklyn because it's a lot more fun. They still will not.
who live in,
Right.
the ones
Nobody
who live in Jerusalem.
That's right. They're not going to go there. So don't worry what they say. Ask what they do, and you can see a big significance in the claim. It happens to us Christians too. There are a lot of Christians who make a lot of big deal about Israel, and they're quite happy to be here, or they go on vacation. Same thing with the various speaking in tongues and all that. It's very clear that if you don't get it right, you must be stoned to death, by the way. That's a biblical teaching, but we don't do that. We don't do that. Anyway, coming back to this about archaeology and proving the Bible, our conclusion is that archaeology is not designed to prove or disprove the Bible. It is to offer evidence so that we have a better shot at narrowing the margins of error. When we make claims about God in the Bible, the more obvious mistakes we can avoid it, and that's a very good thing in itself. Number 6, while physical remains can offer statistical probability of identification, 2 levels of uncertainty remain: accurate interpretation of biblical text and the identification of the correct version of the variants that exist. We're now getting to adult territory, right? What does it mean? So far, we assume that that's one thing called the Bible with many translations. In fact, there isn't one thing called the Bible. In almost every book of the Old Testament has variants, which means different versions of the same text. And it's very shocking because we're not used to that. We're used to my version. Now, this is not the time to do this because there's a whole seminar I did on canonization where I looked at different collections of books in different cultures, and they all call it the same thing. They all call it Bible, but it refers to different things. Number 7, archaeological tools can affirm but cannot confirm identifications with certainty. So we mentioned early on, you have evidence. That's one thing. Having the evidence, now the next step is identification. And even identification is not easy. You can get it wrong. And it's happened again and again in the world of archaeology, historically speaking. Archaeology cannot either prove or disprove the theological inspiration or historical accuracy of the New Testament, since the writers did not write their accounts with a view to demonstrate this. So when you read, say, the New Testament writings, and the claim is often made, this is a fulfillment of an Old Testament prophecy, for example, right? Or that this is a supernatural miracle. It's interesting to note that in the New Testament, the word miracle is not used. The word sign is used. This is a sign. And what does a sign refer to? A sign in itself has nothing to do with supernatural events. It has to do with that when you see this, you will know it refers to this. That's what a sign is. First and foremost, signs are not very important. What the sign refers to is of crucial importance. That's the first thing, right? But the moment you make it a supernatural event, now you get hooked on supernatural events because supernatural claims are low-hanging fruit for apologetics. Which means if you can show fire and walk on water and all that, you don't have to say anything else. It must be my God. Until the others can do that too. And you see that with Moses and the Pharaoh. I can do this, and Pharaoh's magicians come out, and they can do this too. You do that with Elijah and Baal prophets. You can see in the Old Testament itself, the idea of supernatural stuff is not conclusive. And then you find it in Jesus where he tells them, if you're looking for miracles, or you call it signs, looking for signs, your heart's in the wrong place. Because now you're going to worship signs. That's the problem with it. New Testament studies, in that sense, when we say, can archaeology prove that the Bible is inspired? Absolutely not. Because inspiration itself has such a wide range of meanings. And we won't go through it today. We'll go through it, I think, week 6. Now, let's look at statistics, just to give you an idea of the significance of archaeology. In Palestine alone, we have something like over 6,000 archaeological sites have been surveyed. That's a lot of sites in a country as small as New Jersey. 6,000. About 200 have been excavated to some extent, about 30 sites excavated to any major extent. So of the 6,000, only about 30. That's not a lot. And you might ask, what's going on? Why only 30? The typical schedule for an excavation dig can be as short as only 3 weeks in a year. And if you're really lucky, a lot of money, and the weather is good, you may do 3 months. And the reason is this: almost every professional archaeologist is not paid to do this stuff. They are normally professors of anthropology, of archaeology somewhere, and in the summer, in their own time, they do this. It's a labor of love in so many ways.
Biblical archaeological
yeah,
sites?
biblical archaeological sites.
Other,
Well, once you're in Palestine, it's kind of hard to have non-biblical archaeological sites, right? Because everything is based on that.
I mean, you have things like from the Ottoman period too.
Remember this? We're not talking about periods. We're talking about geographical locations. If it's
right,
a biblical,
but I'm saying in modern day Israel, I mean, the Ottomans were there, so they are,
And Ottomans are also religious, highly religious, so they have no problems with that. Okay, let me move on. We have over 1 million documents recovered from Old Testament times, but less than 10% have been published. Think about that. 1 million documents. only 100,000 published, which means you can be an archaeologist till kingdom come and you won't even come near finishing it. Which also means one thing: the final word is not on archaeology. What we have today, what I'm telling you today, is dated stuff, and tomorrow we could discover something fascinating. The typical time between recovery and publication is 10 years, since almost all archaeologists only work during the summer months when they're free. If you're in Australia, you got a tough one because your summer is someone's winter, vice versa, right? The precise locations of many Old Testament places remain in dispute because of uncertainty in changing local conditions, including names. Names of places change over time. Now, I want Danny and Patricia to read some Old Testament and ancient Near East parallel texts. So, who's going to read what?
I was going to read the ancient Near East.
So she will read ancient Near East, and he will read the Old Testament text, and you will see how close the words are, and they will focus on the specific words. This is Genesis 6. So let's start with yours first. Tell us your reference.
So the first text is from actually the story of Gilgamesh.
Yeah, louder for them to hear.
The first text is from the story of Gilgamesh, which comes from Nineveh in Assyria. It's from the early Bronze period between 3300 and 2300 BC. Well, Gilgamesh, let me tell you the story of a divine conspiracy, of a divine plot to exterminate humanity. Godfather Anu, Enlil, and Ninurta convened the divine assembly, which decided to flood the earth. Inhabitant of Shurpak, son of Ubartutu, pull down your house, build a barge, abandon all your possessions, save your life. Take specimens of every living thing on board. Make the ark square with a roof like the dome of the heavens.
Daniel?
So God said to Noah...
give us a reference.
Genesis 6, verses 13, and then Genesis 7, verse 9. So God said to Noah, I'm going to put an end to all people. I'm going to bring flood waters on the earth. You are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures.
Okay, do you see the parallel right there? Building the ark, saving the creatures. I'm going to flood it. I'm going to exterminate humanity. Okay, the next one.
Next one is also from the story of Gilgamesh, and keep in mind that Mount Nisir is in Persia. The ark ran aground on Mount Nisir. On day 7, I released a dove which flew away but returned.
And this is Genesis chapter 8, verse 4, then Genesis 8, verses 8 through 9. The ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Then he sent out a dove, but the dove could find nowhere to perch.
So do you see that in 2 stories? Again, very similar. The ark was built. The ark landed on a mountain. They both are named mountains. They both released a dove, and the dove came back, and Okay, next one.
So this one is a sufferer, and so it's a story called The Sufferer and the Friend in Babylon, circa 1000 to 559 BC. The friend. You are wise and knowledgeable. Do not harden your heart. Do not falsely accuse your divine patrons. The mind of the divine assembly is as unfathomable as the heavens. The way of your divine patrons is beyond human understandings.
Okay, and this is Job chapter 11, verse 1 and 7 through 8. Then Zophar the Naamite replied, Can you fathom the mysteries of God? Can you probe the limits of the Almighty? They are higher than the heavens above. What can you do?
Okay, so what do you read from the last one? Tell us about the parallels that you spot.
Well, it says, can you fathom the mysteries of God? And it says that the divine assembly is unfathomable.
Right, so in both cases, 2 different cultures, hundreds of years apart, tells you a very, very similar story. And by the way, I just selected 3. We have like 30 or 40, by the way. And this book itself, how many we put in? 7 or 8?
7, yes.
Just 7 in this book, but there are so many more like that. And that's what scholars do. They look at the different writings in the region. And I can tell you, this stuff was discovered very recently, less than 150 years ago. To give you an idea of how new this is, none of the Reformation thinkers knew it existed. So for example, if you say, I'm going to read sermons of Martin Luther, John Calvin, you can do all of that, that's fine. They knew nothing of this stuff. So can you imagine the first people discovered this, the shock for them, it's still a shock for me, and I've been looking at this for years. Still, it's striking. Now, what do you make of it? Remember I said, and Chris asked a very good question earlier on, the things I'm teaching you guys now, how do you teach it to the average church person? And the short answer is you don't. The first 2 weeks is for you, to give you background. It is not for you to say, and let me teach you about the parallels of ancient Near East, because you will clear the class so quickly, you have no idea. So be very careful about using this information to, show off and stuff like that. It's an incredible temptation to do that. But see it more as a ministry, right? You get this information, let it percolate inside you, and think about it. I'm going to help you think through this sort of stuff. So to start with, when you find parallel texts in the ancient Near East or Egypt along with the Bible, it is not always the case that the Bible copied them. It's more the case that they're all the same geographical location, same time period, so that this is their vocabulary. This is the way they convey information. And the vocabulary and the use of media, or plural of medium, can be any medium. What's more important behind a medium is the eternal message of God. That's what we're looking for. We're not looking for this. So for example, in the Facebook for Berean, I noted today, so some of you may have read it, about King Solomon having 700 wives and 300 concubines, right? If you're not careful and you say every word of God must be used for teaching and all that, it's no wonder that we struggle with polygamy. And we say, how do we deal with the fact that Solomon, David, Abraham, none of them was a husband and one wife. So we are forced to pretend somehow if God anoints them, they get a free pass. You can see the amount of power given to leaders in that context. And when missionaries went to Africa, many of them to the north part of Africa where there are Muslim cultures and have many wives, you have the missionaries telling them, you kind of got to have one wife because they are reading Paul. And then these guys go, I read about Abraham, Solomon. And Solomon is the wisest man in all the world. If he's wise and he's got 1,000 women, he knows something I don't. And you're telling me to give my 3 other wives? Can you see the problem, right? Then they read Ezra, and Ezra said very clearly you must divorce the wives who are not within the faith. Moses didn't marry a single one within the faith. David almost not. Solomon guaranteed didn't. So when you think about this, you got all kinds of problems. Until you realize the biblical texts are not designed to be teaching tools like that. They are written to tell you what happened then. The biggest story behind King Solomon and the 1,000 wives and concubines is not follow them too. It is to explain that's how they did in those days. And then later on the writers will tell you all the problems that Solomon had. What was the problem? When you have 1,000 wives and concubines, you also have 1,000 father-in-laws, okay? Every one of them, and all your wives want their sons to succeed you. Think about that. Precisely what happened in King David's case, for example. His first son was Amnon. Amnon was killed by his brother, Absalom. Absalom was killed too by another person. And then Abiathar, or the high priest, got involved. And eventually, all the 3 sons had to be executed for Solomon to become king, and Solomon was not the first son. So when you think about all the devious things going around, and that's why David died a very broken-hearted man, there are consequences to the things you do. But just because it's recorded he did it, we can't blindly say, let's follow everything he did. And that's not the case. And that's why we look at the bigger picture behind it. Now let's look at the biblical importance of archaeology now. So remember earlier on I said, what are the things that archaeology can do for the Bible? Then I followed up with, what can the Bible do for archaeology? Now we look at what are the importance bits for archaeology if you want to know the Bible. Number 1, archaeology is God's gift, along with all the other fields of inquiry we call the arts and sciences, to better understand God and His creation. Meaning this, if you live in the world today, especially if you live here in America, especially when you're listening to this right now, watching this video, chances are you are among easily the top 1% of the world's luckiest people alive. You're not at war, you're not dying, you can feed yourself. If you have this opportunity, and you're living today where you have access to the kind of information I'm giving you right now, and they are so compressed and reduced, right? You don't have to kill yourselves in the desert to get this information. It will be the height of arrogance and hubris, number 1, not to use it. It will be irresponsible to pretend you don't need it. And I can tell you from experience, even the most celebrated biblical scholar will tell you, they get depressed thinking about how little they know and how much more there is to know. Number two, to deliberately ignore the tools and help us avoid errors of interpretation amounts to a defiance of God when we make proclamations about God with biblical references. Which means this, I'm speaking to teachers now. If you choose to teach the Bible, and the biblical teaching is a very, very, very responsible thing, because you're making the claim that you're teaching about God, right? You're making, and sometimes making absolute claims. If you dare to do this, you'd better do the best you can to make sure you reduce your errors. Errors will be there. You just avoid enough errors of interpretation. Because everyone who listens to you, a lot of them, they can't check you out. They can't check to see whether you're right. That's why we call this Berean. Because Paul was so impressed that the people in the Berea wanted to check him out. Quite an amazing thing, right? I invite you to do the same thing. Don't trust me. Check out everything I write and say. Number three, the integrity and credibility of Christian witness bears upon whether we really know what we're talking about, especially when it may result in harm or even death to others. This may sound a bit over the top in New York City, but for a lot of places it's not. People die on these sort of issues. People die about whether they believe in God. And I'm going to give you one or two examples. I'm not taking pot shots at, say, specific Korean churches, but we have quite recently pastors being killed as missionaries to Iraq and other places because they were given the impression that they should go because God will protect them. And they're not alone, by the way. I was born in Malaysia. We've had our sad stories as well of people being sent to other places, dangerous places. Now, if they go knowing that they may die and they die in glory, that's fine. But the problem is that many of them were told God will protect you the way God protected Daniel, for example. And these are the irresponsible things that cause irreparable damage. So these are not innocent things. When you talk about interpretation of the Bible, it's not a luxury. It really is serious. One way to not do this is to never talk about the Bible. Then it's okay. But then if you're a Christian and you never talk about the Bible, that's also kind of irresponsible. It probably means you really don't believe in the message in the first place. So you got a problem there, right? Number four, because variations of archaeology have existed from the very beginnings of Christianity, we need to now know which variation is the closest to what you have. And that's why it's a constant looking at archaeology. You never finish it. Finally, we look at archaeology, friend or foe. The Bible, while not a book of history, should be considered a book with elements of history. So back to your question, right? When you say, well, that it's not a history book doesn't mean there are no elements of history. That it's not a scientific book does not mean that there are no elements of science. That is not a geography book doesn't mean that there are no elements of geography. But it means that their primary goals were not history, science, and geography, but they rely on these categories to present a case. So let me tell you this. It is impossible for the Bible writers to write what they did without acknowledging the reality of science, history, and geography. Got to. For example, if they say, and Jesus was born in Bethlehem. That's a geographical statement. He was born during the time of the governorship of Quirinius. That's a historical statement. And when he was how many years old? Under 2, went to Egypt. That's a scientific statement. It's about aging, about age. When he died, how did he die? So anyone who says the Bible has nothing to do with science, history, or geography, that's nonsense. It has everything to do with it, but it is not primarily for that purpose. Despite the ideological slant of the biblical authors, the Bible contains much verifiable historical data. So there are verifiable historical data, and I gave you a whole line of it, right, about the discoveries. Number 2, archaeology cannot either prove or disprove the Bible because historical data cannot prove or disprove theological claims. You can't use history to prove theology, even though we are tempted to do that at every possible sermon we give, me included. For years when I've been preaching, I was hoping to get some kind of historical evidence to prove a theological claim. And then you discover from whom? No finer in mind than Aristotle himself, who developed the idea of a category mistake, the mistake of categories. You cannot take apples to prove pears. And we kind of tend to do that. Because in our world today, in the 21st century, history and science is the dominant verification process. So we want to get that bandwagon. Because you have a camera today, when people say, where have you been? Show me your photographs. Prove it to me. And we do that a lot. We do a lot of selfies. We post on our Facebook to make sure my friends know I was there yesterday, because it's a shortcut to verification. Number 3, archaeology is essential to properly understand the geohistorical context of the Bible. Geohistorical, geography, history. Because the Bible relates to a literary, elitist version of the religion of Israel, whereas archaeology reveals the social context of Israelite religion, including folk religion and counterculture. Now, what do I mean by that? By definition, writing is such an expensive business that when you look at any writing, you are talking about elites telling you what happened. Ordinary people have no voice. The beauty of archaeology is it don't care how rich you are. If you are poor but you live in a house, your house will be archaeologically discovered. Doesn't matter. But if you rely only on writing, you are looking at elites by definition. And by the way, when this was first considered, you can imagine it bothered a lot of religious leaders, because it's basically telling, and it's not just Christianity, every religion that has a sacred scripture is limiting itself to only elite writings by definition. The voices of mostly men, the voices of mostly rich and powerful, and the voices of those whose stuff survived, kept in a fantastic library somewhere, right? Ordinary folks have no voices. When archaeology came about, it really, for biblical scholars like me, it really made me think very hard about the nature of God's love for us. Did only God love the elites, the smart people, those who can read and write? And then you look at the accounts of Jesus, and it's really striking. He kept going for the people who are not elites, and he spent a huge amount of time with them, right? Which means if you have an opportunity for archaeology, archaeology is such an, it evens the playing field a bit, because it allows people who have no voices because they're not politically strong to also have their voice being heard. And that's why it's now changing a lot of the way we interpret the Bible. Because it's looking at the social context, looking at folk religion. What is folk religion? Folk religion is opposite from established religion. Let me give you an example. If you go to rich countries like America and the UK and Europe, you mostly have institutionalized religion. You've got the bishop, archbishop, reverend, right reverend, very right reverend, really right reverend, all the reverends, and you got the whole shebang, yeah? You go to countries where they're really poor, they don't have a lot of that, and sometimes their religion is not established in a hierarchy. They are folk religion in small communities where they don't cross many borders. You go to parts of China and central China, many of them have never been to Beijing. They don't really understand where they're coming from. They don't know who they are in the context of the greater elite writings, but they see themselves as the local community. What about counterculture? This is another important feature. When you look at writings, the nature of writings are such that they're easy to destroy. That's why China is famous for having destroyed just about every major document of culture it's ever had. Every time a king comes through, burn them books. Easy to burn, right? Archaeology, kind of hard to keep burning clay tablets all the time. You can break it, but it's still there somehow. You can grind it, but there's so many of them. So the counterculture is this, the other voices. The voices that are not the established voices. For example, we had 4 major breakups in the Christian church. Right? The first one is in the first century itself, when the Christian church had a disagreement between Peter, Paul, James, and John. These are the 4 major writers of the New Testament, each of them having a specific vision of Jesus that's different from the others. 300 years later, they were all cobbled together, and today we have 4 Gospels and we have the New Testament. It sounds very nice and neat, but they all had slight variations on the way they understood who Jesus was. The second major split came about in the 5th century, 451 AD. Sorry about this, it's not in the notes because I didn't plan to talk about this, but since we're here. And the split was the Nestorian split between the Church of the East and the rest of the world. 500 years later, another major split in 1054 between the Eastern Orthodox, which is in Greek, and the Western Latin Church. Yeah. He's Greek, that's why I keep making fun of him. 500 years later, another split, 1516. This was Martin Luther. This is now between the Protestant churches and the Roman Catholic Church. And then you've got an in-between, which is neither, which is the Anglican Church. Then you've got Anabaptists. So we've got this split in the 16th century, right? Effectively, we have had 4 major splits almost every 500 years. In each category, there is the main culture, and you've got a counterculture. The countercultures do not count because they're normally not accepted as real. So, for example, if you were living after the 11th century and you're living in Russia, Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, any of the Eastern European countries, and you happen to not be Orthodox, tough. Because the political situation is only the Orthodox Church is correct, the rest are not. Same thing with European stuff in the West. So you've got all these problems, right? Now let's look at discoveries and innovations that shape our understanding of the Bible. And I'm going to mention a few. We won't go through any detail today, but I just want you to get an idea of how important it is, discoveries and innovations. Discovery has to do with science, innovation has to do with technology. In the 400s, the invention of the book called the Codex, it replaced the scrolls, made all the difference in the world. When you have scrolls sitting on each other, loose scrolls, there's no such thing as which is the first book of the Bible. It's whichever one you pick, it doesn't matter. Pick a scroll, put it here, doesn't matter. The moment you have pages flattened and stitched together, now the chronology of books are fixed forever. The first book is always Genesis, the last book is always Revelation as far as the book is concerned, right? That changes our idea of what is God's word. In the 500s, missions to the East, the Nestorian mission, also transformed Christianity in bringing to mostly China, the three major civilizations, Persia, China, and India, an understanding of Jesus Christ, which is a bit different from the one in the West, where the idea of Mary takes a different role as well. 1278, approximately the time when spectacles were invented in Pisa. When they were invented, we have less typos of written text because you could see more and see better, and poor lighting. In the 1450s, the movable printing press. Now the problem is you have a lot of identical text, but if you have typo, you have all identical typos along the way. So, pros and cons. 1522, the completion of Victoria, the only ship that came back of Magellan's attempt to circumnavigate the world. The proof that the world is not so much round, that had to wait till 1961. It proved the world was at least cylindrical. Because you went one way and came back the other. No one dared to go north or south because they were afraid of falling off the corner of the earth. Until the attempt by Captain Cook to discover what we now call Antarctica, and he thought it didn't exist. Anyway, 1600s optics, invention of microscope and telescope, the evidence of invisible things. So for the first time, we begin to really think about what Paul said, things invisible that you cannot see. If Paul could use a telescope, he won't use the same words again, right? It's kind of interesting. So even Paul's writings are contextual. Writing when he wrote, he was limiting himself because of technology. 1800s, archaeology, the first study of prehistory, anything before 3500 BC. 1830s, the camera, the first permanent impression of what you can see. 1900, biblical archaeology, an attempt to prove the truth of the Bible. 1940s, Qumran and Nag Hammadi discoveries, the alternate text of the Bible discovered for the first time. What alternate text? That means the Bible you have today is not the only one. There are variations, and that shocked the system. 1950s, radiochronometry, the first method to independently date artifacts. 1961, Yuri Gagarin on Vostok 1, the first human eyes to see that the world was actually round. 1990, search engines and digital Bible, the first capacity to do a comprehensive comparative textual study of the Bible. Before that, you just couldn't do it. 2000, the decade of the brain, cognitive neuroscience, and all the implications of memory, all the implications of what it means to see. 2003, discovery of the Indonesian hobbits among the multiple human species. From 2003 onwards, everything changed about what is a human. Now we know there are at least 5 to 6 different kinds of human species. Which one did Jesus come to save? Right? Very serious problem. This is a very serious problem. Sorry?
The hobbits.
Yeah, the hobbits. Okay, as we close, and we'll take questions later on. As we close, I want to preview next week when we come back, and I'll send you slides along this line as well. We'll look at what exactly is the Bible, and we look at the information about the Old Testament. What are the sources that gave rise to the Old Testament? Into the surprise, one of the sources is the New Testament itself. How can the New Testament be a source for the Old Testament? Because we're talking about interpretations. We're not talking about the stuff. Okay, great. We are done now. I'm going to take a couple of questions if you have any questions. So anybody has questions on this so far? One. Anybody else? Hearing none? Okay.
Okay.
So.
Well, I have 2 questions. You can choose whether you want to answer any of them.
Okay.
So first, I think you referenced that American explorers in 1865 were trying to defend against German schools.
American is 1870, UK is 1865.
Yeah, 1870. My bad.
It's okay.
They were trying to defend the Bible against the German school of thought. Can you elaborate on what the German school of thought was then?
The German school was referring to the idea that history is now a science. It's no longer your story, like history, his story.
Okay.
How can it do that? Because the camera was invented. In fact, not long after that, the very early idea of moving images began to be invented, even before Edison had his own ideas of moving images. So the whole concept of what happened in the past that could be almost proven was a major threat to the idea of biblical studies, because what if it's not the case? What if what they saw was not what you expect to see? Because bear in mind, until the 19th century, very, very, very few people, scholars included, a lot of people who wrote Bible stuff, actually checked the facts. They assumed the facts, but they didn't check it. And it wasn't that they are bad people, it was incredibly expensive. And just for the record, so those of you who sponsor all my trips, it is still incredibly expensive. It is so expensive still today. And this is with all the modern technology. A single trip can really set you back quite seriously. And that's why it's not really done much in the professional academy. The other thing that the Germans began to develop, and this was with Immanuel Kant in 1781 and later on by the 1800s, the students of major thinkers, including Hegel's work, was they began to question what are the things that we can know and what are the things that we can't really know because of the limits of the human mind and also the nature of the senses. What was it that Kant was concerned about in Prussia? And he talked about the things of God are the noumena. They are not expressed in measurables. So for example, when you say God created and God loved and God did this and God did that, how in the world are you going to demonstrate it? We're not talking about proofs here, even demonstrate it. The closest we can demonstrate is, I'm going to ask God in 5 minutes, I want God to send a thunderbolt and do this. You can. In almost every case of the Old Testament writings, where it talks about the fulfillment of prophecy, it is not clear that they are predictive prophecies. That's another problem. In almost every case, there's enough evidence to show that it was written after the fact. So for example, something happened, earthquake for example, and many writers will say this is God punishing, or this is the reason for that. Later on, by the 1940s, when we we confirmed plate tectonics, and people began to say the whole damn area is earthquake territory. You're supposed to have earthquakes. God or no God. If there are no earthquakes where the rift happens, then what is the place altogether, right? And they can see that in places, religious places where there are no earthquakes, their gods don't seem to make earthquakes. But in places where there are tsunamis, their gods seem to do a lot of water stuff. Like Japan, right? Japan, a lot of paintings of tsunamis and waves and all that. Because these are 4 islands. So they began to realize that a lot of religious texts reflect the realities of the natural world, not the other way around. It's not always the case that God is going against his creation. And one very important apologetic is this. If you find it in your life, you don't seem to see many miracles, it's a good thing. It means God's creation is pretty good. If you constantly have God tweaking the universe and changing laws of physics, it's very scary stuff because you never know, like Inception, you never know which dream you're in. Right? The whole point is you're supposed to have some confidence that this is the real world. Okay, and your other question is?
I have a follow-up to that, but I can ask the next question. You said that every 500 years there's kind of like a big split, so
Yes.
we're technically in the 5th split time.
Yeah. Every time I say that, somebody asks this question, yeah.
So what would you predict in like if you see the fault line?
Well, here's the thing. In the 4 times previously, it was measurable because we look back and we say 15, 16. I guarantee you, in Martin Luther's lifetime, he wasn't thinking, at that time that happened. I banged the thesis in and there we go, 95 thesis. It's in retrospect you identify date. My guess is it's happened already. And you're a part of it. What does that mean? The fact you are here right now, okay, as confessional Christians, and you guys listening to this and watching this, we are not angry non-believers. We are people who care about the things of God. We are people who care about the Bible. We are people who care about things that matter. And we are studying this and asking some very serious questions about the inheritance of our knowledge. We're not questioning God. We're questioning our inherited explanation, which is a different thing, right? I think in the day of computer technology, the World Wide Web and all that, this is the biggest, hugest sort of split you can possibly have because it's universal. It's not geographically limited to Europe. It is anyone who can get to YouTube can now watch this. Can you imagine that? What I've just said today in 2 hours, it's said permanently. I can't even try to remove it. I've said it. It's somewhere. Someone's going to misquote me somewhere. But the point is, it's there. So when you think about how technology makes it possible, I think it's not so much a split now in the church as a time of renewal where people began to ask very serious questions about the nature of God. That we should not keep on inheriting things of the past and not question it. We should question it in good graces. We should ask questions because we want to know where the margins of error are less than before. Okay? This is such an important lecture because starting next week, we're no longer going to do this stuff. We're going to go straight into the Bible. Okay? So any more questions based on last week's or this week's? Okay, hearing none. Hearing none. Let's have Chris. Why don't you pray for us as we close?